Now when we come to the year 406 BC, we come to a period when both Alcibiades and Lysander are not in action. Alcibiades is now permanently out of action because he has been exiled from Athens after the disastrous loss at Notium. Lysander is temporarily out of action because he had to step down as navarch after his one-year term, as required by Spartan law. So Lysander has been replaced by a much more aggressive hotshot named Callicratidas. Now, Callicratidas took command of the Spartan fleet and immediately zoomed off to the east and came across an Athenian fleet anchored offshore at the Arginusae Islands. If you check your map, you'll find the Arginusae Islands near the big island of Lesbos. They're in between the big island of Lesbos and the Asia Minor mainland. Callicratidas brought the Spartan fleet over there and was able to blockade an Athenian fleet moored there. Not surprisingly, this caused enormous panic among the Athenians on board. However, our familiar problem came up again. The Spartans got drunk afterwards, and as a result, did not maintain the Spartan fleet blockade on the Athenian fleet as rigorously as they should have. So the Athenians observed this, and they hatched a plot. They picked out two ships that they would attempt to sneak through the Spartan blockade and get word back to the city of Athens that they were in distress and that the Athenians needed to come and help. And so, in the middle of the night, the two ships snuck out and approached the Spartan ships. And at a point when they could see that they were not observed properly, they managed to rush through. The Spartans did see them as they were going through and were able to chase down and catch one ship, but the other ship got away and got word to the Athenians. When the Athenians at home heard about this, not surprisingly, they were absolutely apoplectic. They immediately assembled another portion of their fleet to go and assist the Athenians in the blockade. And they also added a whole group of additional fighters, including slaves, on board the ships, something that they had not tried since the Great Harbor battle at Syracuse just before the defeat at Sicily. The Athenians promised that any slaves involved in the battle who helped the Athenians to defeat the Spartans would be granted enfranchisement. They would be freed and become full Athenian citizens. This had never happened before, and we don't know of too many other cases where it happened since. And so it went. The Athenians got their fleet together, and out they went to fight. Now, when they arrived, not surprisingly, they got the Spartans into disarray because the Spartans did not expect reinforcements to come, and there were some maneuvers, including taunting, that went around between the two fleets. There was a great deal of nervousness because the weather appeared to be deteriorating and the waters were getting choppier, because triremes, by virtue of their very narrow keel, do not handle rough water very well. Eventually, the Spartans finally made their attack against the Athenians, but the Athenians were well prepared and able to receive it. In the ensuing battle, the Athenians counterstruck against the Spartans and finally defeated their fleet. In the middle of this, Callicratidas fell overboard and drowned, a very disgraceful way to lose. So the Athenians were able to vanquish the Spartans and break their blockade. Just at that moment, however, the storm broke. Now, quite a few Athenian men, as one would expect during a naval battle, had fallen overboard. But unfortunately, because of the storm, the Athenians were not able to go and pick up these men up. In addition, word came that another Spartan general somewhere else had started a revolt. And so the Athenians had to call away the fleet in order to go and deal with the revolt elsewhere. It appears that the general who was responsible for the rescue of the men at sea was Theramenes. But Theramenes would end up making the claim that he had delegated that responsibility to some sub-commanders under him. And so when this whole matter blew up at Athens, Theramenes claimed that he was not in fact the one responsible for the rescue of the Spartan men. In any event, when word got back to Athens, about the battle, they were thrilled at the victory. But then they heard that many men who had fallen overboard had died because the Athenians had not taken proper care to rescue them after the battle. As a result, the generals were all recalled in a body and were put on trial illegally, unconstitutionally, together. It was in the middle of this trial that the head commanders, including Theramenes, made the claims that sub-commanders under them, who were responsible for the rescue of the men overboard, had not carried out their duty properly. Now, when it came to the actual vote for the verdict, it happened that on that day, the person in charge of calling the assembly, the epistates, was the philosopher Socrates. Remember back when we talked about Athenian government, that the epistates was the person selected from the Prytany tribe, the one of the 10 tribes responsible for that 10th of the year to run the assembly. He was the one in charge of actually calling the meeting as well as calling any votes. Socrates refused to call the vote on the principled objection that this entire trial was unconstitutional. But Socrates only was epistates for a day. So all that happened was that he completed his term, the assembly was adjourned, and then it was called again the next day, and the new epistates went ahead and called for the vote. According to Xenophon, a speaker got up and, in a relatively lengthy and impassioned speech, vigorously opposed the conviction of these generals under these circumstances, again calling upon the immorality, the unconstitutionalness of this vote, and attempting to sway the Athenian populace to call it off. But despite his powerful rhetoric, he was not listened to, and the vote went forward, and the generals were, in fact, convicted. One general, however, of great importance in later Athenian history, Conon, C-O-N-O-N, managed not to go home. And as a result, he was in exile, but would eventually be recalled from exile after the conclusion of the war, and would contribute quite effectively to Athenian warfare later in the 4th century BC. But in all events, many of the talented generals of the Athenians were illegally convicted and executed. This trial of the generals had a fractious effect on Athenian politics in months thereafter, as the Athenians gradually came to realize that paranoia had gotten in front of them, and that they had reacted in a completely inappropriate way. They actually ended up rounding up all of those who had persuaded them to put these generals on trial, and then eventually to convict them, and executed them as well. But, of course, it was too late. So now we have a big crisis of leadership with the Athenians. Exactly who are we to bring back, or who are we to find? And they did not really have any other generals except for those who remained out in exile, who were not actually caught and convicted to death. So Aristophanes, in his final 5th century BC comic play called Frogs, has a big rhetorical contest between the tragic playwright Aeschylus and the tragic playwright Euripides. And in the midst of this big contest that's held underground in Hades, because of course both playwrights were dead by this point, Alcibiades comes up as the topic of discussion between the two playwrights. The playwrights are discussing their different merits as playwrights, and the judge is the god Dionysus. He's actually gone down to the underworld, supposedly to bring up the ghost of the playwright Euripides in order to give advice to the city of Athens as to how they should continue the war. Well, when he gets down there, he discovers that Euripides and Aeschylus, the two ghosts, are having a dispute because the god of the underworld, Pluto, wants to select one of them to occupy Pluto's special chair for high tragedian. But these two both think that they should have it. And so each one is trying to outdo the other. So in the middle of the contest, Dionysus judges the two sides, the two different sets of talent and skill and enthusiasm that each of the playwrights has. And of course, they're quite different from each other, as you've now read in this class, because Aeschylus is a much older playwright from an earlier time and writes in the high style, whereas Euripides is a much younger playwright, much more rhetorically influenced, and writes in the low style. So after the poetic contest goes back and forth, and there is no real result, Dionysus can't choose. There's now a political contest to decide the outcome, and each one has to give a poetic response to a particular question. One of the questions is, what should be done about Alcibiades? Should he be recalled? Both playwrights give a poetic response basically saying, well, we probably should not have trusted Alcibiades in the first place, but given that we've come this far and that he's available, we probably should recall him and keep our fingers crossed, basically. Dionysus still can't choose whom to bring back up to the city of Athens. This playwright will also, by the way, be appointed to the chair for Pluto's dining table. So Dionysus now asks a second question, which is, how should the city of Athens be saved? And Aeschylus gives a really rousing couplet in which he reminds the assembled multitude of the Athenian strength at sea, that what they need to do is trust to their ships. And that's what does it. And Dionysus ends up choosing Aeschylus, despite his original promise to bring up Euripides. So Frogs demonstrates in 405 BC the desperation that the Athenians have at this point about the war, having had this enormous success against the Spartans in 406 BC, and then basically undercut it severely by executing all of these generals on what they finally came to realize was really a trivial charge, one that should really have been worked through with much more rational and sane minds. I might finally mention that there is a slave in Frogs, Xanthias, the one who serves under Dionysus, who gets constantly frustrated because Dionysus makes him carry huge bundles of luggage. And at one point, Xanthias swears at Dionysus, says, I just so badly wish that I had served in that sea battle, because then I could tell you exactly where you can go. And of course, they are going to hell anyway. And that reference to a sea battle refers to Arginusae, the fact that if Xanthias had served, which he ended up not doing due to an eye disease, that he could have basically been as good a man as his master Dionysus, and again, could have told Dionysus off. Later on, when Euripides is reciting prologues during the big contest, Aeschylus takes Euripides to task because Euripides says that Oedipus was a happy man at first, but then became the most unfortunate of men. And Aeschylus says, no, that's silly. Oedipus was always a very unhappy man because he was tossed out as a baby onto the mountain, and his ankles were pinned through, and he ends up being raised by foster parents. When he gets back to Thebes, he ends up marrying this really old woman who could probably have been his mother. Oh, wait a minute. Actually, she was his mother. And he ends up blinding himself. So isn't that a pretty miserable life? And Dionysus says, yeah, he would have been a lot better if he had been the companion of Aristeides. This would have made the Athenian audience squirm, because Aristeides was one of those generals who ended up being executed in the trial. So Aristophanes has some very effective ways to let the Athenians know how very badly they've screwed things up. But they still have one chance, maybe, to turn things around. They don't. See you next video.